So when I first heard about the facade pattern in NgRx, I thought, that's strange. First of all, we try to integrate NgRx into our application, and then we do our best in order to hide it again from our components. I saw some advantages, but for me it was simply over-engineering. But over time, I found out that this pattern actually contains or provides quite a lot of advantages that I want to share with you in this episode. So welcome, my name is Rainer Hanekamp. I'm a trainer at Angular Architects, and this episode consists of 3 parts. First one, we will cover the theory of facades, then we will do the implementation, and then in the third part, we will discuss all the advantages that it has. Let's start. So the facade pattern is actually an architectural pattern. We can also see it as some kind of an API, and it is based on the modularity strategies that I have already discussed in one of the former episodes. But let me quickly repeat it. So we can see our application's architecture from a perspective that we say we are going to divide it up into 3 levels or areas. We have first of all the app shell, which doesn't contain so much. The majority of our code part actually is distributed or is split up into different domain modules. So we apply domain-driven design to it. And then of course we also have some kind of shared code which is used by all the different domains. And as I said before, the majority of our code should actually be located in the domain. Second comes the shared part or the shared modules. And then the least code is more or less the app shell, which is just containing in Angular the routing configuration, some kind of core services, and it's just kind of providing the routing configuration for our domain modules. So if we then look into the domain modules themselves, we find that they are again have some kind of sub-modules, which are the data, feature, UI, and model. What are they? First of all, we divide up our components of a domain module into 2 different groups. We have our container components and we have our presentational components. The presentational components are responsible for the rendering. They don't interact with the dependency injections, and they are not able to actively fetch or send data to the backend. So they only focus on the rendering, on the visualization part. The data communication and setting up the data for the presentational component is task of the container components. So they are part of the so-called feature components. They don't contain so much in terms of template because, again, it's more or less logic, getting data, sending data, mapping data, and then passing it on to the presentational component for rendering. Then we have the data module, which is actually including the NgRx or a feature state. And the 4th module type is the model module type, which means it contains only the domain models. So you can say it's just a bunch of interfaces that you have. So these are the 4 different module types inside of a domain. And then we also have dependency rules between them. So we say the UI components, they are not allowed to interact with NgRx directly. It always needs to go via the container components. That's why we have them actually. And we can use some tools that will enforce these kind of dependency rules. And at the moment, would be NX or Sheriff, which is an alternative, a lightweight alternative to the NX dependency rules. And then comes the facade. The facade, as I said before, you can see there's some kind of an API of NgRx. So we say that inside of our data module, we place a single service that provides the actions in the form of a method. And when it comes to the selectors, it's just a normal property that returns an observable. And by doing that, our container components that are allowed to communicate, to interact with the facade, they don't know that we are actually using NgRx. For the container components, it's just method and properties. And this gives us a decoupling between NgRx and our components, which means we have all options to later kind of replace NgRx with another state management library if we want to. We can also kind of go back to a behavior subject if we want, or the other way around. We can also, first of all, say we don't want to use NgRx. We want to try to get, or just to start very simple. And when you have the need for NgRx, then you just apply it internally, but to the outside, nothing has really changed. So this is now our application. It's a very simple one. It's a CRUD application where we can manage customer entities. So we have here our list of customers. I can edit one. I can of course also delete an entity, and I can of course also add a new one. This complete feature is implemented with NgRx obviously. So we see here our actions. We see also how the state looks like. So we have here our customers list inside of it. If we now jump over to the source code, it looks like this. So I have identified the customers feature as an own domain, and I have divided it up into 4 different sub-modules. So we have data, feature, model, UI. The feature and the UI contains the components as I have explained before. We have here, for example, the customers container component, which is responsible for the list itself. And we see here that the template is very minimal. It is just calling the UI component app customers in that sense, but it is doing the subscription to the customers observable already. And well, if we take a look into the customers UI component as well, then we see that it contains quite a lot of template, but not that much in terms of TypeScript. It's just one input and 2 different outputs. So this is about the feature and the UI module. Then we have also our model module, which only contains just one interface. It's the customer interface and nothing else. And then our NgRx, the feature state, is located in the data module. So we have here the common stuff. And because I'm using here Sheriff in order to enforce the module boundaries and the dependency rules, we don't see here any libraries as we would have if I would have gone with NX, but there's just one index.ts file there. And with this index.ts, I'm already marking that particular directory. And of course, the same is true for feature, model, and UI as a module. And everything which is now exported in this index.ts is now able to the outside, or is now exposed to the outside. And we see here that we are kind of exporting our customers, the customer selector from customers, and a limited set of the customers actions. So if I click on customers actions, we see there are quite a bunch of them, but I say, well, the loaded, the added, updated, removed, these are actions that I actually don't want that somebody from the outside should be able to dispatch. I only want that my effect can dispatch these actions, and that's why I'm going to hide them. So in the index.ts, I'm just exposing load, add, update, and remove, and nothing else. Then we also have here the provide customers, which is necessary for the in order to set up the feature state, but that's it more or less. So this is it about the modules that we use, and now comes the facade. So when I want to create a facade, I need to implement it in a way as an Angular service. And I do this in my data module. So I say I have a new file, and I call that one customers facade TS. That's a normal service, ng service. Okay. I say here customers facade, and the first thing that I have to do is that I have to inject my store. So I say private inject store, and then I implement my actions as a method. So when I have, for example, the action method, then I provide a method load. When I have the action load, then I need to provide it as a method load, and in it I say this store dispatch customers actions, and then I say here load. Of course, when it comes to the import, I also need to make this right. I need to access the file directly because I'm inside of the module. And the same more or less is then also true if my action requires some kind of payload, so some properties. So if I, for example, if I say there is this remove action that requires an ID, well, then it's a method that requires also a parameter of an ID, and then I just call it here again. So I say dispatch customers actions, remove, provide the ID, yeah. And that's it. Then of course I need to continue to do this for every action that I have. And for the selectors, I provide properties as long as they are not parameterized selectors, because then I again need to go to with a method. But as long as they are the normal selectors, I'm going to use a getter method actually. So I say here get customers, which from to the outside looks like a property. And I say here as soon as somebody accesses the customers observable, I'm going to return the selector of from customers select all. Right. And that's it. That's my facade. So a little bit of an overhead, but actually quite a very easy task. There is not so much to think about it. The next step is that I now need to remove my NgRx actions as well as my selectors, because now I'm going to replace them with the facade. So I say, okay, these two are not exposed anymore. Instead of it, I'm going to expose the customer's facade. Like this. And from now on, all my components that used to dispatch customers actions or used to select something from my customer state aren't working anymore, because now they all have to use the customer's facade. So let's start with the customer's container component. And we see here already we are getting an error because it's not part of the index anymore. But the thing is, of course, I could now, theoretically, I could do that I say, okay, I'm going to import the from customers directly from the selectors files. In TypeScript, that's going to work, but not with ESLinting or with Sheriff enabled or NX enabled, because now it realizes that this is a DB import, which is not allowed. So there is no chance for me to import anything except going directly to the index.ts. So instead of the store, I need to say here, I am importing or I'm injecting the facade, the customer's facade. That's the right one. And when it comes to the customer's observable, well, I'm just going to change it to facade, and I'm directly accessing the customer's observable as it is, and I'm done. I could even simplify it, because the facade in the end is just a collection of groups of selectors and of actions that are internally dispatched. So I could also say that the facade is something that I'm directly exposing to my template as well. So it's not private anymore, it's now protected, which means I can access it in my template. And here I can say, okay, it's the customer's observable is actually a property of the facade object, of the facade service, and that's it. And then again, now in the same way, I would have to update the edit, the new customer as well, and need to add the missing methods and properties to my facade. So I have updated now my code, everything is now working, everybody is using my facade. What about the advantages? What benefits does this actually bring? So when we look into our components, we can already say it's a little bit easier to work with the facade compared to the store. It's a little bit less of code, but that's not the only advantage. It's also easier when you have a large team, when you have many developers. So you could say there is a special team that knows, it has a knowledge on how to use NgRx in the right way, and they are specialists in NgRx. And then you have another team which is more or less only working on the components. Now the component team, they don't need to know anything about NgRx anymore, because they are only working together, or they are only working against the facade itself. So this is one thing, for example, one advantage how you could kind of scale your development team and in a way distribute the knowledge. The main advantage though is something completely different. The main advantage is the decoupling from NgRx from our components. So if I have the facade, I could theoretically start with a behavior subject. So I could say, okay, instead of using here already NgRx, it's a very simple use case. Why not just use the HTTP client and do the communication with the backend directly in the facade itself, which means I also need to come up here with a behavior subject. So I say here I have a behavior subject of type custom array, and this is now that replaces more or less the state, a very easy one. So every time the access to customers happens, I don't say store select anymore, but I just say, okay, I am returning you the customers as an observable. That's the same. And when somebody wants to load it, when somebody wants to load the customers, then instead of dispatching an action, I need to look up the right HTTP call. Then I say, well, I'm not dispatching the action. I have my HTTP client right in the facade. I say I want to go to my backend. I'm requesting the customers in this case, and then I have my subscribe in it, where I say this is the response. And then I just say, my dear customers behavior subject, I have new customers for you, response content. And of course I would have to do the same thing with the remove, with the update and with the add commands. But in the end, I have now the option to start with a behavior subject. So I can start with it. And if I say, okay, now it becomes a little bit more complicated, I need or want to switch over to NgRx, I want to upgrade, then I have, of course, a very easy time to do that, because I just need to integrate here NgRx in the data module, and for the components to the outside, nothing actually changes. And in the same way, I can also do the other way around. So when I say, okay, maybe I have overdone it in terms of NgRx, I want to go down to the behavior subject, then we also have the options. So if you say now, okay, that's a good argument, but I don't care because in my application, I see NgRx as a critical part. I'm not planning to replace NgRx in the near future. So that's not something for me. It doesn't, I'm not persuaded. Well, for those of you, I have other advantages that this facade also provides. So the first advantage is that with a facade, we can integrate some kind of logic that we couldn't otherwise have done by using natively NgRx. What do I mean by that? Or what example can I offer? Well, if we look into our customer routes, see here, for example, that there is a can activate, there is a loading process triggered. So every time our users navigate to our customer's route, we internally go to our feature state and say, hey, look, you need to load the data. Good. What we could do now is that with the help of a facade, we could change it, that we say we only want to load the customers on demand. So if some of our components actually wants to access the customer's data. So we don't say it should start already to load when our users first kind of enter the router navigation. We really want to start when somebody actively says, look, now I want to have the customers. So with my facade, I could say that there is now, let me switch back, all this behavior subject. We are not going to go back to the behavior subject, obviously. We stick to NgRx. But what I could say now is that I have another private property where I say is loaded is false. And then I have a function which I call assert loaded, which does what it says. It asserts that the data has been loaded, and if not, it just starts loading it. So I say here, if this loaded, if this is wrong, false, then I first set it to true, and then I'm going to dispatch customer actions load. Okay, which by now means that the load method is actually not available anymore. So I show everybody from the outside, you are not able to load your customers or to trigger the loading process of customers anymore. I will take care of that internally. And in all my selectors, I just have two. Before I'm returning the selector, I call this assert loaded function. One time, two times. And now the loading process really only happens when somebody accesses the customers. Again, in my example, maybe not the best use case because it's a very simple one, but if you have a larger application, and this on-demand loading is definitely a good thing. And you see, with the Facade, you can implement this very easily. With native NgRx, you can't, because otherwise your selectors would be required to dispatch actions, which is something that doesn't really work. Another further advantage of using Facade is that we can improve the possibilities of our selectors. For example, we have here our edit customer component. This edit customer component gets the customer via the ID. Now the problem is that this will always be an observable with customer or undefined, because it could happen that I have an ID, but the customer with that ID doesn't exist. In many cases, we actually would prefer if the observable in this case would not fire anything. So we say in our template, we have an ngIf. So if the customer is not there, then we just don't show anything, and we can also come up with a message, but we don't want to deal with these union types all the time. This is not very handy. We have seen this especially when Angular introduced the strict mode in TypeScript, where kind of quite a lot of code changed in a way that the type could also have been undefined, which was not something very nice. And we have here more or less the same behavior or characteristic. Now, the selector, is not guilty or anything, because the selector says, if you want to select something via the ID, then I need to call, of course, the find on the customers array, and it could happen that the customer is not there. The problem is, with a normal observable, I could fix it, because I could say I only want to filter the customer objects, and I want to remove an undefined, for example, so that I'm reducing down the observable of customer or undefined just to customer. But with a selector, that's not possible, because a selector can't come up with any pipe operators. So this is not an observable. Selector is not an observable. So what we're doing here is that every component that wants to use the by ID selector needs to deal with the possibility that the observable is emitting an undefined. So what I want to achieve now is this, that I say it's just customer, and if the customer isn't there, then it shouldn't fire anything. With a Facade, I can do that, because with the Facade, I have the observable right in front of me, so I can come up here with a pipe operator that says filter defined. And this filter defined is doing exactly what it says. It is filtering out only defined values. And from now on, I am providing an observable of a customer, and all my components will thank me for that, because they don't have this union type anymore. If you're interested what this filter defined is doing, then you see it's just a very simple operator which is relying on this type guard here. So there is a type guard that says whenever the value comes through, I will return a false when it's null or undefined. TypeScript understands this and then interprets, or not interprets, but then defines that this observable T, this type T here, will never have a null or an undefined anymore. That's the trick. If you want to know more about these kind of type guards in TypeScript, there is quite an interesting video from me. Highly recommend you to watch it. That's just one possibility how we can improve the power of our selectors. There is another one which I personally think is even more important. Not about this filter undefined. That's more or less, it makes it more comfortable to work with it. But there is something else. If we go into our app customer, into our form, and we see here that we are using here reactive forms. And what I'm going to do now is that I will create another input, but this time the input will not use a reactive form, but it's going to use a template-driven form. So I say here NgModel, I want to use the customer and the first name. So I say here ngF customer. Okay. So I need to close this mud form field here as well. So the thing is, at the moment, when we look at our components, or if I want to edit something, yeah, I think I've missed to import some dependencies, reactive forms module. Ah, it's already there. Forms module is also there. No, it should actually work. Yeah, it's working. So at the moment, if I change something in this first name of the reactive forms, that's going to work. Why? Because, I mean, why not? The thing is that my reactive form is, of course, getting the customer from my state and is internally cloning it and is using this cloned values in its input fields. We know that NgRx has an issue when mutable changes on the state happen. That's why in our reducer we always go with the spread operator. What most of us, or what many of us, don't know that all the selectors that we have, that they are actually exposing the state directly. Which means in my components, when I have a situation where a component is updating the state data in place, we would have a mutable update, which would cause an exception, a runtime exception, which we don't want. Yeah, so there is some other issue, as I see. It's more or less my incapability to write a proper form. So mud input, NgModel, form control. Yeah, maybe I'm going to remove that one. Always these forms. Yeah, now it's working. Yeah, so now we have here our first name input, which is using a template-driven forms, and they are known to do the change in place. So if I change something here, we see that the NgModel is now actually changing it, as I said, and we're getting a runtime exception coming from NgRx. Because NgRx says, hey, look, this Laetitia that you have here, you were just starting to modify it in a mutable way, and I'm not going to allow you to do this. So the problem is what we have here is that we need to make sure that every time we are exposing some of our state to our components via the selectors, that they are always cloned. I don't think it's a good idea that we say we don't clone it, we just provide it to our components and we tell our components developer, oh, by the way, make sure that you don't do a mutable change. That's not going to be allowed. You will get a runtime exception. That's not a very nice way to do it. And I mean, if your developers stick to these kind of rules, we will never know what kind of third-party libraries we are using that will do a mutable change. So we need to do the clone inside of our facade, which is something we can do. So in my facade, I say instead of filter defined, or in addition to filter defined, I say I have here a map where the data comes in, of course, and then I'm doing a structured clone. Data. Please import it. And from now on, I am on the safe side. So does it work? Nope. Does it now work? Yes. And from now on, I have here cloned my object, which means as soon as my state exits my facade, it's cloned. So my template-driven forms can do whatever they want. They can mutable change the state. It doesn't really matter because it's a cloned state. And NgRx doesn't care about it. Okay. So of course, and now what you should also do is that you say, this is actually a very important function. And we can call it deep clone, that you want to provide for all your selectors. So everywhere you just add your pipe, do a deep clone, and then it's just working fine and you don't need to be afraid of some mutable changes and runtime exceptions. If you ask yourself about the structure clone, where that one comes from, that's a new function of the Web API. So all the modern browsers support it already. In the past, you had to go with Lodash, or you did something like JSON stringify and then JSON parse. That's not necessary anymore. We have now a native function that we should use. So the last advantage that you get when you use a Facade in NgRx is that it makes testing also easier. I have here a unit test or a component test that tests my container component. So NgRx is very good when it comes to providing utility functions for testing. So we have here this provide mock store, where I can provide my state. And that means that whenever somewhere in my component, in my services that my component depends on, are using the store service internally, then this state is used. So very good. What this test here is doing is that it just verifies that the row customer is more or less rendered with a p tag containing CSS class name, and we just more or less verify that this customer that I have provided also shows up. But there's one thing which I don't find so nice. I'm writing a component test. I don't care about NgRx. I'm mocking NgRx. So it's more or less again the same argument that I have already mentioned in the very beginning. The Facade makes sure that you don't need to care about NgRx at all, even not within the tests. So what this provide mock store requires from me, that I need to know how my state looks like, what is the name of the feature state, and also how the feature state internally looks like, so that it has a customers property containing the customers array. I don't want to know all about these things. I don't care about them. I'm just focused on my component itself. With a Facade, it's easier because I could now also come up with a mock just for the Facade and can more or less eliminate NgRx completely. How do I do that? Well, I say here, I have my Facade mock. That's a partial of the customer's Facade. Well, and then I just say, yeah, I know that my container component is only accessing the customer's property like this. So you know what? I am returning you an observable that contains this single customer here, this Sabine Miskovic. Yeah, importing all the missing things, of course. Yeah, it also now turns out that it is not that type safe, the version that I've done before, because there is an ID. It's also actually called birth date and not birthday. And now I can take this, and again, I don't need to know here how my NgRx state looks like. I don't care. It's just another service that returns an observable that I need to mock here. So I say, okay, provide mock store, please go away. I have an alternative because from now on I provide the customer's Facade, and for that I use the value Facade mock. Okay. And if I run the test now, it hopefully works. Takes some time. Maybe a good opportunity to mention that we're also providing a testing workshop. No, but let's quickly also verify that the test is really doing what it is supposed to do. So we are kind of enforcing here an error, and the error message looks all right. So we see the test is really testing what it should do, and we are happy with it. All right, so I hope I was able to kind of persuade you of the advantages of the Facade pattern. It is, of course, a little bit of an overhead that you have to invest, so a little bit of time. but it definitely pays off. So given the amount or the advantages that you get, it's more or less nothing. So you have seen it's very easy to implement a facade. And again, the advantages. You're getting a decoupling between state and the rest of your application. You have the possibility to integrate logic into the data module, which otherwise would have been done by the container components. We can also extend our selectors. Just think of the cloning feature, which is already reason enough for me just to use the facade. And in terms on, or in the area of testability, we also get some benefits from it. If you're interested in more content about NgRx, I can highly recommend you to join one of our NgRx workshops. We always try to keep it up with the latest technologies. So at the moment of this recording, at the time of this recording, we are integrating the signal support to it. You just need to navigate to our website and then you can read there the latest dates. Yeah, and that was it already. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate and ask. Just add some comments or questions in the comment field on the bottom. And I would be happy if you would subscribe to my channel. And thanks again for watching and see you in the next video. Goodbye.